The winter of 1989 had not yet arrived when Willa Carver stood at the bathroom sink at 5 in the morning and looked at her hands under the yellow bulb above the mirror. She looked at them the way a person looks at something they have carried so long. They rarely think to examine it anymore. The knuckles were enlarged on both hands from years of work in cold weather. The skin across the back of her right hand held a pale scar from a metal edge she had not seen coming in the dark of a February night 6 years before. The fingernails were cut short, and 2 of them carried the faint gray staining beneath. That does not wash out, no matter how long you scrub, because it is not dirt anymore, but something deeper that the skin has absorbed over years of engine work and iron and the particular residue of a life spent fixing things. These were not the hands people imagined when they pictured someone who was about to write a check for $100,000. She dried her hands on the towel beside the sink and went downstairs to start the coffee. In 2 hours, she would drive to an auction in the northern part of the county and stand in a crowd of men she had known most of her life and do something that none of them expected. But that morning was still ahead of her. The story that brought her to it stretched back 2 years, and further than that, and further still all the way to a shop behind a farmhouse, and a man named Harlan Carver, and the kind of education that cannot be purchased or accelerated, only absorbed. It begins in October of 1987. The Lundgren Farm liquidation sale started at 8 in the morning on a Saturday that smelled of early frost and turned diesel. About 40 men had gathered across the yard in the way men gather at these events in loose clusters, talking low, moving from piece to piece with the patient deliberation of people who are either going to buy something or find reasons why they would have bought it if the price had been different. The sky sat low and the color of old tin. The ground was hard enough that footsteps made no impression. The Oliver 1650 sat at the far edge of the equipment line, separated from everything else by a gap that might have been accidental, but did not look accidental. It had been orchard green once, decades ago. Now the paint had faded and chipped to a color between rust and memory. The engine block carried a crack along its lower face that someone had addressed at some point with radiator stop leak, which told you both when the problem had been noticed and how seriously anyone had intended to solve it. The injection pump was seized. Both rear tires had been flat long enough that the sidewall rubber had taken on the shape of the rim flanges permanently. The air cleaner stack was open to the sky and had been for long enough that a robin had used it as a nesting site the previous spring and no one had bothered to cover it afterward. The original seat was gone entirely. A 5-gallon plastic bucket had been wired to the seat platform as a replacement. The bucket had a hole in the bottom. A man named Eckert, who bought scrap iron out of Marshalltown, opened the bidding at $25. He walked the length of the machine, once ran a hand along the cracked block, the way you run a hand along something you believe you already own, and came to 30. Then he stopped. He looked at the machine for a final moment, stepped back and crossed his arms. He had priced it as scrap and was not going to pay more than scrap warranted. The auctioneer looked across the yard. Willa Carver raised her hand. $40. Boyd Mercer was standing 3 feet to her left. He was her brother-in-law, married to her older sister, Donna, a man who had come to the sale to look at a disc harrow in the second row and had no intention of becoming part of any other transaction. He was close enough to speak without raising his voice, and he did. He asked her what she was going to do with it. She told him she would figure something out. He looked at the tractor again as if a second examination might reveal something that explained the decision, and then he said, with the tone of a man who believes he is performing a service that their father would have said she was throwing money through a window. She did not respond. The auctioneer said sold in the voice of a man completing an obligation rather than a transaction. The crowd was already drifting toward the next lot. Vera Tibbet was standing near the fence line 20 feet away. She was the wife of the fertilizer dealer on the county road east of town. A woman of around 50 who processed information about her neighbors with the efficiency of a machine built specifically for that purpose. She had not come to the sale to buy anything. She had come because these were the occasions where the real business of a county happened, the kind that did not require paperwork or signatures, but shaped how people were regarded for years afterward. She had heard Boyd's question and Willa's answer. She had seen the look that passed between them and the way neither of them moved from it. By noon that day, it would be part of the conversation at the diner counter on Main Street. By Wednesday, it would have reached the co-op east of town. By the following Friday, it would be circulating with the particular energy that attaches to a story people find genuinely inexplicable. The version Vera told at the diner was not cruel. That was what made it effective. She said she just did not understand it, which was her standard opening when she understood something perfectly. She said she supposed there was a plan in there somewhere, she just could not see what it was. She said that Willa Carver was a capable woman. No one was disputing that she just wondered who was looking out for her. She said this while passing the sugar, and it landed exactly where she intended it to land. She went further than that. She said she would bet that by planting season, the Carver woman would be either hiring a professional shop to deal with whatever she had brought home, or trying to unload the whole mess at whatever price she could get. She was specific. She set a timeline, and she believed every word of it. The consensus that assembled itself over the days that followed held that the Carver woman had paid $40 for a problem she did not need for a machine that the scrapman himself had not found worth following through on, and that the whole business said something about what happens when a woman tries to run a farm operation without someone present to talk her out of the bad ideas. It was the kind of consensus that forms quickly in small places and holds long after the evidence has stopped supporting it. The consensus was wrong about nearly everything. It would take close to 2 years for that to become undeniable. But we are not there yet. To understand what Willa Carver was actually doing at that auction, you have to go back to a concrete-floored shop behind a farmhouse in Grundy County, and to a man named Harlan Carver, and to the particular education that happens when a capable child spends enough time in the right building with the right person. Harlan poured the concrete floor of his shop over 2 weekends in the fall of 1961, doing it in sections because the full slab would require more help than he was going to pay for. The tin roof went up the following spring. The wood stove in the northeast corner he fed exclusively with hedgewood because it burned hot and slow and could hold a working temperature through a February night on 2 loadings. The workbench along the south wall was built from 2-inch oak planks, salvaged from a granary that had come down in a bad wind. Planks so dense they barely showed wear after 30 years of use. The machinist's vise bolted to the end of that bench he had found at a government surplus sale in 1953. Still packed in its original shipping grease, so well preserved that the stamping on the casting identified it as wartime production, made in a factory in 1944. The drill press in the corner came from a closed implement dealership in Iowa Falls, more than a decade after that. The tools on the pegboard above the bench were organized by function, and had been organized the same way since before Willa could form a clear memory of the shop. This meant she had learned their positions not as a list to be memorized, but as a spatial fact, the way you learn the geography of a room you have moved through in the dark enough times. Harlan had a principle he stated with enough regularity that his children could recite it without thinking. A machine you own outright works for you. A machine with payments on it works for the bank, and you are just the one getting dirty. He applied this to the 240 acres he had inherited from his own father, with a mortgage of $22,000, which he had paid clear by 1959 through farming it as hard as the soil would support. and spending almost nothing that did not go back into the land or the equipment. By the time Willa was following him into the shop most evenings, the farm had been free of debt for years, and Harlan treated this not as something to take pride in, but as the baseline condition of a farmer who intended to remain a farmer. He had worked 7 years at the Case dealership in Grundy Center before deciding he would rather put his knowledge to use in his own building on his own terms. The decision cost him a steady wage, and he never expressed regret about it. What the dealership had given him was a thorough understanding of how machines failed when they were maintained poorly, and what they were capable of when they were maintained correctly. And the difference between those two outcomes was almost always the same thing: whether the person responsible had been paying attention or not. Willa was the second of 4 children, and the only one who chose the shop over the house. She chose it because the shop was where the real education was happening, and she understood this early in a way she could not yet have articulated, but felt as clearly as temperature. There was one evening she returned to across the years. She was 9 years old, or close to it. She was holding the flashlight while Harlan lay under the belly of the International, both of them in the dark, and the cold metal smell of the concrete floor. He said without looking up the 3/8 combination. She walked to the pegboard, the tool board in shadow beyond the reach of the work light, and put her hand directly on the right wrench. Not because she had studied a diagram, because she had spent enough evenings in that shop that her hand knew where things lived. Harlan reached out without looking up, and she placed it in his palm. He said right, which was his complete vocabulary of praise delivered without ornamentation. She stood there in the cold and held the light steady, and felt something she would not have a word for until much later, when she understood it as competence, the particular satisfaction of being exactly where your knowledge is needed. That was the education, not a curriculum, not a formal transmission. Just a man working and a girl working beside him and knowledge passing between them. The way heat passes through metal through contact and time. Harlan taught by doing and expected learning by watching. He did not explain what he was doing unless the explanation was necessary for the specific task at hand. When she made an error, he did not correct it with words, but by showing her the consequence of the error, and then demonstrating the correct method once, which was enough. By the time she was 15, she could identify by sound the difference between a diesel running with proper timing and one that was beginning to drift. By 17, she had done her first full valve adjustment on the John Deere under his supervision, and had done it correctly. He verified it with his own feeler gauge after she was done. He set the gauge back on the bench without comment, which was its own form of confirmation. In the late summer of 1974, Willa packed a suitcase. She had been accepted to the University of Northern Iowa in Cedar Falls and was scheduled to leave in the first week of September. The suitcase sat beside the front door for 6 days, brown and hard-sided with a broken wheel on the right rear corner. She passed it every morning going out to the shop and every evening coming back. It represented something real. Then the doctor in Grundy Center spoke to the family with the precision of a man who had learned that softening a diagnosis only delayed the harm. Harlan's heart had given its first warning, and the pace he had been working at was not something his body would support going forward. The brothers were already established elsewhere. Willa was the one who was here, and the one who knew the equipment, and the one whose presence mattered to what needed to happen next. She brought the suitcase upstairs, set it on the bed, and began taking things out. Her mother, Dorothy, appeared in the doorway. She watched for a moment and then asked if Willa wanted to talk about it. Willa folded a shirt and put it in the drawer and said there was nothing to talk about. Dorothy stood another moment. Then she walked in and picked up the nearest item from the suitcase and began folding it herself. They finished unpacking together in silence. That was the way the women in that family handled the things that could not be addressed with words, by doing the necessary thing in the same room, which was its own form of conversation. Willa told her mother she would go the following year. She did not go the following year. She never went at all. And she never discussed this as a sacrifice or a loss, which was itself something worth noting about who she was. She took over the mechanical work on the farm gradually through 1975 and into 1976. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she was capable and present, and the work needed doing, and paying someone else to do it was a line item Harlan had never once put in the farm ledger. By 1978, she was performing the annual mechanical overhauls on both of the farm's tractors herself, ordering parts through the dealership, and doing the work in Harlan's shop on winter evenings after the daily work was finished. She kept a ledger that tracked every part purchased, every labor hour spent, every dollar saved against the dealer's estimated rate. Not because she enjoyed the accounting, because the ledger was the one document that told her the truth about her operation without adjusting for comfort, and Willa had always preferred the unmodified version. Harlan died in the early morning of a Tuesday in March of 1983. He left her the farm, the shop, the tools, and a savings account at the Grundy County State Bank, containing $41,000 accumulated across 3 decades of spending less than he earned. There was no mortgage, no operating loan, no equipment, no debt of any kind attached to the 240 acres. That was what Willa Carver inherited at 27 years old. That was what the county thought it understood about her situation. The day after the funeral, before the rest of the family was up, she walked out to the shop alone. She did not bring a tool or a task. She stood in the center of the concrete floor and looked at the pegboard for a long time. Then she reached up and took the 3/8 combination wrench from its peg, held it in her hand for a moment, and put it back where it belonged. She went inside and started breakfast. The planting season was 10 days away. She ran the farm through 1983 and 1984, and into 1985, with the methodical efficiency of a person who has inventoried everything they have and decided not to waste any of it. The savings account grew by $4,000 to $6,000 most years. She watched the farm economy around her deteriorate under conditions that the numbers at the end of each year made increasingly difficult to survive. Land values in Grundy County had fallen by 40% from their 1979 peak. The corn price had spent most of the decade below $2 a bushel. The interest rates that had climbed to 18% earlier in the decade had come down, but not far enough and not fast enough for farmers who had borrowed at 1979 prices on 1979 optimism. The county courthouse had processed more foreclosures in the preceding 7 years than in the previous 4 decades combined. The feed store in town had lost 6 of its largest 15 accounts. The implement dealer had stopped stocking certain categories of new equipment because the financing had dried up along with the demand. Farms that had been in families for 3 and 4 generations were being sold at auction, and the prices they brought were not the prices anyone had expected when the loans were written. She watched her neighbors lose their operations, not because they were bad farmers, but because they had built their operations on borrowed money at borrowed prices. And when the prices fell and the rates held, the arithmetic stopped working, and the banks came for what the banks had always technically owned. She watched all of this from a farm with no debt and said nothing about it. There was a man named Purcell who farmed a section to the west. She had known his family since childhood. His father had been a friend of Harlan's in the way that neighboring farmers are friends, which is to say they helped each other during harvest and talked at the feed store and did not need to formalize any of it. Purcell had expanded in the late 1970s at the rates available in the late 1970s, and by 1984, The operation he had borrowed to build was consuming more cash to service than it was generating from the ground. She saw the first sign in the spring of 1984, when the field adjacent to her west boundary went in 10 days late. She saw the second sign in the fall when the equipment sat dirty through November, rather than being cleaned and stored. By the spring of 1985, the auction notice had appeared in the county paper. Purcell's son stood in the yard during the sale and did not speak to anyone. She did not attend. There was nothing she could have done, and being present would not have changed that, and she saw no point in witnessing what did not need a witness. In April of 1986, she drove west on US 30 and then south on a county road outside of Ames until she reached a salvage yard that bought and parted out dead farm equipment. The yard was run by a man named Dolph, who knew Harlan Carver by reputation and greeted Willa with the careful respect that men in that trade extend to customers who know exactly what they came for. She had located this engine through 3 phone calls made over the preceding month. It was a 1971 Oliver 1650 engine pulled from a machine that had gone over a creek bank and bent the frame beyond repair. The engine itself had not been damaged. Dolph walked her to the back of the yard where the strip machine sat, its frame bent severely to the left, most of its sheet metal already parted out to other buyers. Willa spent 45 minutes with the engine using a bore gauge she had purchased from a machinist supplier in Waterloo and a micrometer for the main bearing journals. The cylinder bores were within factory specification. The journals were clean and well within tolerance. The valves were worn but serviceable after hand lapping. The crankshaft showed no measurable runout when she rolled it by hand through its arc. This was an engine that had been enclosed in a dead machine and had nothing wrong with it that a competent rebuild would not fix. She paid $65 for it. She covered it with a canvas tarp in the corner of Harlan's shop and spent the following 16 months sourcing rebuild parts from 3 different suppliers, comparing prices without hurry, finding each component at the best available cost. She kept a small, separate notebook for this project distinct from the main farm ledger. In that notebook, she tracked parts prices suppliers, and in the final column on each page, the number she had written as her limit. The limit for the platform she still needed was $60. She had written that number in ink, and she did not plan to revise it. In the fall of that same year, a sedan came up the gravel drive on a Tuesday morning, and a man in a suit got out carrying a briefcase. His name was Owen Stratton. He was the agricultural loan officer at Grundy County Farmers Bank, and he had been making rounds to farms he considered candidates for expansion financing. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a set of brochures and told Willa that land values had stabilized, that the bank had capital available, that there were farmers in the county who were positioning themselves for when the market fully recovered. He used the word opportunity in a way that suggested he believed it would do some of the work for him. He pointed to figures in one of the brochures. Willa let him finish. Then she asked how many agricultural loans the bank had written in the county over the previous 5 years. He said somewhere between 40 and 50. She asked how many of those farms were still owned by the people who had signed the original notes. Owen picked up his coffee and did not answer right away. When he set it down, he said the agricultural environment had presented challenges. She thanked him for stopping by and stood up. He gathered his brochures and walked back to his car. She watched him go from the kitchen window and noticed something she had not been looking for. The license plate on his sedan was a rental designation. The man who had come to her farm to explain the benefits of long-term financing had driven there in a car he was paying for by the day. She filed that away without deciding what to do with it, which was how she handled most things she found significant, and went back to the shop. The notice appeared in the Grundy County paper in the 3rd week of September, 1987. Farm liquidation sale, the Lundgren property. Saturday morning equipment list attached. She read the list twice and found the Oliver 165, O described as a parts unit or project. She drove out to the Lundgren farm the following Saturday with a flashlight and a pry bar and spent 45 minutes underneath and around the machine. The frame was straight. She verified this with a tape measure between 3 pairs of reference points. The transmission case was uncracked. The rear axle housings were solid throughout. The hydraulic pump was seized, but the housing was intact and rebuildable on the surface plate in the shop. The sheet metal was rough but present. The electrical system had been stripped forward of the firewall, but the rest was there. She drove home and wrote a number in the small notebook. $60. That was the ceiling. That was the number above which the project math no longer worked. On the morning of the auction, she arrived early and stood near the equipment line for a quarter hour before the bidding started, not to look at the Oliver again, but to observe the people who were looking at it. Eckerd from Marshalltown examined it for 3 minutes, opened the hood, closed it, and walked away. Chester Holden, her neighbor to the north, looked at it once. From 10 feet, shook his head at something he said to the man beside him, and both of them laughed. Vera Tibbett stood near the fence with her husband and watched Willa watching the machine with an expression of polite curiosity that stored information for later use. Eckerd opened at 25. He came to 30 and stopped. The yard was quiet in the way a yard goes quiet when everyone present has already decided what something is worth and are waiting for the formality to confirm it. Willa raised her hand. $40. Boyd appeared at her elbow and delivered his opinion. She gave him her answer. The auctioneer said, sold. But here is the thing about a transaction. The visible part is rarely its whole truth. What the county saw was a woman paying $40 for a machine that the scrapman had passed on. What had actually happened was the completion of a plan that had been running for 16 months. In the corner of Harlan's shop under a canvas tarp was a 1971 Oliver 1650 engine that had cost $65 and that she had personally measured to factory specification. She had been accumulating rebuild parts for it from 3 suppliers for over a year. She knew what every component of the engine rebuild would cost because she had already found most of the parts. She did not need the engine in the machine she had just purchased. She had the engine. What she needed was the frame and the transmission and the hydraulics and the axles and the sheet metal. She needed the rest of the tractor at a price that held her total cost below the number she had calculated. The scrapman quit at 30. She bid 40. She had room to spare and did not need it. Boyd called that evening. He asked again what she was planning with the persistence of a man who believes patience will eventually produce a more sensible answer. She told him she was going to fix it. He said their father would not have made this purchase. She said their father had spent 20 years teaching her exactly how to make this purchase. She set the phone in the cradle and went out to the shop. She pulled the canvas tarp off the engine in the corner and stood looking at both objects under the shop light. The engine that had waited 16 months and the chassis that had waited its entire life to be used by someone who knew what to do with it. She pulled the robin's nest from the air cleaner stack and set it outside on the ground. She moved the engine to a working position. She sat in the wooden chair at the bench and opened the small notebook and checked the numbers one final time. $40 for the chassis, $65 for the engine. Rebuild parts already located and priced from 3 suppliers. The total, if she did all the labor herself in her father's shop, using her father's tools, would come to somewhere just above $450. The same machine at the Oliver dealership in Grundy Center listed for $19,400. She closed the notebook and put it in the drawer. She fed the wood stove with hedgewood and waited for it to catch and hold. She put on the canvas work shirt that hung on its peg beside the door. Outside, the first hard cold of October. was settling across the fields. And somewhere to the north, across the fence line, Chester Holden was probably in his kitchen telling someone the story about the Carver woman and her $40 mistake. She picked up the first wrench and went to work. There will be a night in January when everything Willa Carver has planned for 16 months will appear to have failed. She will be alone in a cold shop at 2 in the morning with a rebuilt engine that will not start. And for the first time in a decade, she will sit with the particular silence of a person who is asking herself whether she has been wrong about something much larger than a tractor. That night is coming. But first, there is the work. November arrived the way it always arrived in Grundy County without negotiation. The harvest was in. The days shortened past usefulness by 4 in the afternoon. The shop became the center of Willa's life in the way it had been every winter since she was old enough to hold a flashlight steady. She began the rebuild with the same first step her father had always used when starting on a machine of unknown history. She inventoried everything before she touched anything. The cracked block from the 1968 chassis she pulled with the engine hoist and set outside the shop door. It would bring $12 as scrap in the spring. She wrote that in the notebook as a credit. Then she worked through the rest of the 1968 machine piece by piece, writing 2 columns, usable and discard. And by the end of the first evening, she had a clear picture of what she had bought for $40. The transmission was sound. She drained the contaminated oil into a catch pan and found no metal accumulation in the pan beyond the fine gray particles that are the normal residue of a machine that has lived its working life. The rear axle assembly needed new seals and bearings on the left side, where someone had let the oil run low for long enough that the surfaces showed the early stages of damage that comes before failure. The hydraulic pump housing was intact, and the scoring on the pump body was within what could be corrected on the surface plate with lapping compound. The sheet metal was dented and surface rusted but present. The electrical system from the firewall back was complete. She arranged the parts from the pump disassembly on a clean shop rag in the order she had removed them, each piece touching the next in sequence, so that reassembly would require no thought about order, and all the thought could go to condition. This was something Harlan had done without explaining why, and she had absorbed it as method before she understood it as logic. In the last week of November, she drove to Des Moines on a cold, clear morning that smelled of snow that had not yet arrived. She was looking for a man named Frank Briggs. Frank ran a diesel injection shop on Hickman Avenue that had occupied the same brick building since the late 1950s. The place smelled of petroleum distillate and coffee that had been warming on a burner since early morning and was now past the point where temperature and quality had any relationship. Frank was 65 years old, built the way men are built when they have spent 4 decades doing physical work in small spaces with forearms that looked permanent and hands that had their own biography. He had known Harlan Carver for 30 years and had been to the funeral in March. He looked at Willa for a moment when she came through the door. Then he went to the middle drawer of the gray steel cabinet behind the main bench and took out a manila envelope that had gone brown at the corners and soft along the fold from years of being in the same place. He set it on the counter between them. He said that Harlan had left it there in 1981. He said Harlan had told him if Willa ever came to this shop without him to give it to her. She picked up the envelope and looked at it. Her name was on the front in her father's handwriting. The compressed all capitals printing he used when he was writing something he intended to last. She opened it at the counter. Inside were 3 sheets of paper, covered on both sides with notes in pencil, organized by system, cross-referenced in the margins. The kind of documentation a man produces when he has worked on a specific machine enough times to know exactly where it lies to its owners. The notes were for the Oliver 165 O injection system. Every common failure point, every symptom that presents before the actual failure. the sequence of diagnosis that eliminates causes without wasting parts. In Harlan's shorthand, dense but legible if you had grown up reading it, this was a complete map of the machine's particular dishonesty. At the bottom of the third sheet in pencil that had been pressed harder than the rest, so that the impressions survived whatever years had softened the graphite, her father had written one sentence: "If Willa is reading this without me, she is already doing the right thing." Frank had turned to face the cabinet as she read. He stayed that way. She read the 3 sheets twice, folded them back into the envelope, and put the envelope in her inside jacket pocket. Frank turned back around. She set the injection pump housing on the counter, and he looked at it the way he looked at everything, without hurry, tilting it toward the window light. He spent the better part of 2 hours on it. During that time, he spoke only when the work required a question or an observation. He told her at one point that the internal clearances he was measuring were better than the factory spec from the production year, which meant someone had done a careful rebuild on this pump at some point in its history and had not advertised the fact. He said that was not uncommon. A farmer who did his own work and did it right did not usually tell anyone, because telling anyone invited argument from people who had not looked at the evidence. When he was done, he set the pump housing back on the counter and told her it was in better condition than most of what he saw from machines that had been running the previous week. He charged her $55 and did not round it up. She paid in cash, which was the only currency Harlan had ever used and the only one she carried. She was almost to the door when Frank asked why she did not just buy a new one. She said because a new one would cost $19,400, and she did not have that in her account to spend. He asked about the bank. She looked at him. He nodded and said he had asked a stupid question. She said she had heard stupider and went out to the truck. December settled over the county. Inside the diner on Main Street, Vera Tibbett was doing what she did with the efficiency she brought to everything she considered her domain. She was telling people things she believed to be true. What Vera told the women at the counter in the second week of December was that she had heard Willa Carver was having financial difficulties. She said this with the delicacy of someone performing a public service. She based it on evidence that seemed reasonable to her, the fact that Willa had not purchased any new equipment in years that she was doing mechanical work herself, rather than hiring a professional shop, that she was spending her winter in a shed, rather than taking the trip to visit her sister in Minnesota that she had mentioned the previous spring. Vera did not say these things with malice. She arranged them as facts and let the interpretation present itself. She said her prediction from October was proving right, that the $40 purchase was going to turn into a problem that ate time and money, both, and that she half expected to see the whole sorry business end up in a classified ad before spring. The story traveled with the speed that stories travel in small places where the material of other people's lives is understood as common property. By the middle of December, it had reached the co-op on the county road east of town. The manager there was a man named Cutler, who ran a careful operation and protected it by being cautious about credit, even when caution was not necessary. When the delivery driver went out to the Carver farm before Christmas, he asked Willa if she wanted to talk about adjusting her payment schedule. She asked him what her current balance with the co-op was. He said there was no balance, her account was current. She thanked him and closed the door. That evening, she opened the main farm ledger and looked at the final number in the savings column: $44,300. No debt on any line. No open accounts with any creditor. She closed the ledger and went back to the shop and continued lapping the valve seats with the patience of a person who understands that the quality of the seal will determine the quality of every hour the engine runs, and that there is no shortcut in this that does not eventually announce itself. The month of December passed in the rhythm of evening work and early mornings. She honed the cylinder bores with the rigid hone borrowed from a machinist in Iowa Falls, who had been one of her father's professional acquaintances, a man named Westcott, who had lent it without being asked for any further explanation than that she needed it. She lapped the valve seats by hand until the contact ring on each one showed continuous and even. She replaced the main bearings and rod bearings, the head gasket, the valve stem seals, the timing cover gasket, the rear main seal. She set valve lash to specification with a feeler gauge, checked it, set it again. The parts total for the engine rebuild came to $88. The transmission bearings and seals were $41 from a bearing house in Cedar Falls. The rear axle components were $33. Lapping compound and the new pump seals were $11. The wiring harness was $22 from an electrical supplier in Waterloo. New injection lines, which she replaced as a matter of principle on a machine that had sat open to weather, were $31. Front tires were $48 for the pair. The rears from the original 1968 chassis were sound and needed only air. Paint and primer and sheet metal screws were $19. Filters and fluids and miscellaneous hardware were $26. She added the columns in early January and wrote the total at the bottom of the notebook page. Then she wrote the separate line below it for the two items already spent before the auction. $65 for the engine, $40 for the chassis. She added everything together and underlined the result, $479. On the second page, she wrote the comparison number, the dealer list price for a new Oliver 165, O.N. Grundy Center, $19,400. Below that, she wrote the cost of a 5-year note at the going rate, which produced a total of approximately $24,000 when the interest was added. She looked at the two numbers for a moment. Then she drew a line through the larger number and wrote two words beside it. Not savings. Capital. She closed the notebook. January was at its worst that week. The kind of cold that presses down on a landscape and makes everything silent and still. She had put off the final assembly until the engine was ready. And the engine was ready. She spent 4 days putting everything together in the correct sequence, the way her father had put machines together from the inside out, each system tested before the next one was installed on top of it. On the night of January 22nd, which was a Thursday, the thermometer outside the shop door read 4 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. She had run the wood stove since 3 in the afternoon, and the shop was holding 50 degrees, which was adequate. The Oliver sat fully assembled in the center of the concrete floor. She had checked the oil level, the coolant level, the fuel in the tank. She had primed the system through the hand primer on the fuel filter housing. She had verified continuity in the electrical circuit from battery to starter to solenoid. She sat in the wooden chair that had lived beside the bench her entire life and looked at the machine for a moment. Then she stood up and turned the key. The starter engaged. The engine turned over. It did not fire. She waited 2 minutes and tried again. The engine turned over cleanly, compression evident in the effort the starter was making, but no combustion. She tried a third time, a fourth. The fifth time she turned the key and listened to the starter work and heard nothing ignite. She released the key and took her hand off it and placed it flat on the steering wheel. Outside the shop, the wind moved across the fields, with nothing in its way for 60 miles in any direction. She could hear it against the tin roof the way you can hear it when everything else is stopped. She sat there. The thought that came was not about the fuel system or the air in the injection lines. That would come later. What came first was older and larger and did not announce itself as fear, because it had not needed to present that way before. It was the question she had not allowed herself to ask since the October morning she bid $40 on a broken machine in front of 40 men who watched her do it. What if she was wrong? Not about the engine, about the whole of it, about the decision to stay when the suitcase was packed, about the 30 years of choosing a concrete-floored shop over every other thing that could have been chosen. about the assumption she had built her life on, that the knowledge she had been given was sufficient, that the tools on the pegboard were enough, that a paid-off farm was a better inheritance than the kind that comes with a name on a diploma. She sat with that for 20 minutes. She did not try to resolve it. She let it be present in the cold shop while the wood stove ticked and the wind made its case outside. Then she got up and got the flashlight from the bench and got down on one knee beside the engine and started checking from the beginning. An hour and 40 minutes later, she found it. The fitting on the primary fuel line at its junction with the injection pump inlet was seated at an angle of less than 2 degrees off true. The deviation was not visible to the eye without measurement, but it was enough to allow a small and intermittent air pocket to form in the high-pressure side of the system under the specific conditions of cold start after the engine had been sitting. The pump was primed. The engine had compression. There was simply an air path where no air path should be. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the manila envelope. She opened it in the light of the flashlight and found the second page of Harlan's notes and the margin annotation she had read twice in Frank Briggs's shop check for air ingress before blaming the pump. She had not connected that annotation to this symptom when she began her diagnosis. She was connecting it now. She corrected the fitting in 15 minutes, reseated the line, bled the system by hand, cleaned the work area. Then she stood up, walked around to the left side of the machine and turned the key. The engine caught on the second revolution, not all at once. It stumbled into itself the way a diesel does in the extreme cold, firing on some cylinders before others finding its balance. The exhaust notes starting rough and uneven, and then smoothing as the temperature rose in the block and the fuel system normalized. She stood beside the machine and listened to it for 10 minutes without moving. The idle settled into the sound she had been listening for since April of 1986. Low, even unhurried, the sound of combustion happening exactly where it was supposed to happen, at exactly the intervals it was supposed to happen. She went to the bench and picked up the notebook and wrote, "Started." The time was 14 minutes before 2 in the morning. The temperature outside the shop door was unchanged. She wrote nothing else. She did not need to. She shut the engine down after 15 minutes, logged the running time, and banked the stove for the night. She walked across the yard to the house in the dark and went to bed. She slept without difficulty, which was something she had not been certain she would be able to do 3 hours earlier. The first week of March came dry and cold, with the specific clarity that arrives in Iowa after a winter that has done everything it intended to. Willa hitched the Oliver to a 4-bottom plow and drove it out to the North 40. The ground was ready. The engine was at temperature in 10 minutes. She lowered the plow at the north end and began the first pass. The hydraulics responded without hesitation. Clean lift and clean hold. The transmission moved through its gears with the specific quality of mechanical work that has been done correctly. No resistance, no searching. Each gear fully engaged before the next was needed. Under load, the exhaust note stayed clean. She watched it over her left shoulder during the first 2 passes. A dark line of vapor that cleared to nothing within 20 feet. Not smoke, just combustion finding the air. She worked through the morning. The field turned behind her in the even lines that a properly working machine produces the kind of work you can see from a road and know without needing to be told that the equipment doing it is right. On the afternoon of the second day, Chester Holden drove his truck to the fence line on the north side of the field and sat in it for the length of a full pass. When Willa came back to the end nearest him, he was standing outside the cab, leaning against the front fender with his arms crossed. She brought the tractor to idle. He looked at the machine running for a moment. Then he said he had a question of a mechanical nature. She waited. He said the exhaust note sounded heavy in the middle range, not throughout, but specifically around 16 to 1800 RPM, and he wanted to know what pump she was running. She looked at him. Chester Holden was 61 years old and had farmed the quarter section to the north for 30 years, and she had never heard him ask a question about injection equipment before. What she recognized in the question was something she had not expected to recognize in him, the listening. The ability to hear a machine from 100 feet away and identify a characteristic of its fuel delivery by the quality of the note. That was not a skill that came from reading. It came from the same kind of repetition that had put her hand on the right wrench in the dark at 9 years old. She told him what pump she was running and where she had gotten it serviced. He asked the name of the shop. She told him. He stood with that information for a moment, nodding in the way of someone adding a piece to a set. They have been building for a while. Then he said it sounded right. She said it was. He put his cap back on and got in the truck and drove north. When the truck had passed beyond the tree line at the edge of his property, Willa sat on the idling tractor and did not immediately put it in gear. Something had shifted in the previous 10 minutes that she had not anticipated. Chester Holden had come to that fence line not to inspect a mistake, but to listen to an engine. Whatever he had thought in October of 1987, when he and the man beside him laughed at the auction line, what he had come to that fence with now was a question only a mechanic would think to ask. She did not forgive him the laughter, but she adjusted her understanding of what was standing on the other side of the fence, and adjustments of that kind had practical value. She put the tractor in gear and continued. What she did not say to Chester that afternoon, because the information was hers, and the plan attached to it was still running, was that she had been reading the bids and parcels in the county courthouse real estate records for 8 months. She knew the approximate state of the debt on every farm within 3 miles of her property. She knew that Chester Holden had an operating note at Grundy County Farmers Bank in the amount of $87,000. She knew that corn had spent 2 full years below the price at which that note could be serviced from the crop alone without drawing down equity or extending terms. She knew what those conditions produced, not because she was predicting anything, but because the records of the courthouse made the arithmetic available to anyone who chose to read them. She had chosen to read them. The summer of 1987 had been the driest in Grundy County since 1936. What 1988 would bring she did not know. She was not counting on anything she could not measure. March became April, and April became the planting season, and the planting season became summer. And the summer proved neither as bad as the previous year, nor good enough to change the underlying arithmetic for farms that were carrying significant debt at commercial rates. The news from the county courthouse continued to be what it had been. She kept reading it. In the fall of 1988, she bought a used combine from a retiring farmer in Tama County for $3,200 and rebuilt it over the following winter in the shop. She did not think of the combine as a separate project from the Oliver. They were the same project. The same logic applied to a different machine. The combine rebuild took longer than the tractor had, partly because the machine was larger, and partly because some of the electrical routing required fabricating a section of harness from raw components, rather than buying a pre-made replacement. She did this on 2 consecutive evenings in January, using the wiring diagrams she had ordered from a technical library in Ames and the electrical supplies she had driven to Waterloo to purchase in bulk. The total cost of the combine rebuild was slightly higher than the Oliver had been, but the combine was a more complex machine, and the delta between what she spent and what a comparable unit would have cost at the dealer was proportionally similar. Her neighbor, Margaret DeLacy, arrived unplanned on an afternoon in February of that winter, coming off US 30 because a traffic obstruction on her route to Cedar Falls had pushed her onto the county roads, and she recognized the farm and stopped. Margaret had been in Willa's graduating class at Grundy Center High. She had gone to northern Iowa in the fall of 1974, when Willa had taken her suitcase back upstairs. She was a school administrator, now driving a sedan that she had mentioned was still being financed. She stood in the shop doorway in a wool coat that was too light for the temperature outside, and looked at the strip combine in the center of the floor and the tools laid out in sequence on the bench. She looked at the Oliver in its place against the north wall, where it lived between field seasons. She looked at Willa in canvas work clothes standing in the middle of all of it with grease on her hands and the shop radio on low on the shelf above the drill press. She said with the careful warmth of someone who means what they say, but is not sure how it will land, that it sounded like useful work. Willa said it was. Margaret said that she had sometimes wondered over the years whether Willa had gotten what she wanted from the path she had taken. The shop was quiet for a moment. Willa set down the part she was holding and looked across the floor at the Oliver against the north wall, its rebuilt engine at rest. The machine that had come home in pieces in October of 1987 and had been in the field every planting and working season since. She said she had not chosen the shop because there was nothing else. She had chosen it because this was the only place she had ever been taught something that held its value, the way the things she learned here held their value. Margaret nodded once with the expression of someone receiving an answer they had not been sure they were going to get. She stayed for coffee and was on her way within the hour. Willa watched the sedan go down the gravel drive and turn onto the road, its rear end slightly wide, in the turn the way a front-wheel drive car is in winter. She stood at the window for a moment after the car had gone. Two women the same age, from the same town, who had stood at the same starting point in September of 1974. One of them had gone and one had stayed. And this was not a comparison that had any simple answer, because neither of them had chosen badly given what they were working from. But Willa understood something in the quiet, after Margaret's car disappeared, that she had not needed to put into words before she had not remained in this shop and on this farm, because her path had been closed. She had remained because the education available here was the one that was going to matter, and she had been capable enough to know that at 18 years old, and the 30 years since had been the proof. She went back to the bench. The fall of 1989 arrived with its own weight. More farms had gone to courthouse auction in the preceding 12 months than in the 4 years before that combined. The feed store in town had lost 2 more major accounts. Chester Holden had sold the timber parcel at the back of his property the previous fall. She had read about the sale in the property records. She had done the subtraction and knew it had not been enough. He appeared at her door on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of September. He was wearing his work clothes, which was different from wearing what he would have worn if he had thought of this as a formal occasion. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee, and the expression of a man who has rehearsed a speech and found sitting in the actual chair that the rehearsed version is no longer adequate. He told her the complete shape of his situation without decoration. $87,000 in principal, $14,000 in accumulated late charges, $23,000 in unpaid operating balance for the current year. Total debt against the farm was approaching $125,000. The land at current market would appraise somewhere between $160,000 and $180,000. If corn came back to $3 within 2 seasons and stayed there, the arithmetic became survivable. If it did not, the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings before the following planting season. He asked her for $30,000, a private loan at whatever rate she wanted, enough to service the interest and buy time for the market to do what markets eventually do. She poured coffee for both of them. She sat down across from him. She looked at the number he had given her and ran it where it led. $30,000 would cover the interest payments for approximately 18 months. After 18 months, if corn had not recovered, the underlying debt was unchanged, and the bank would proceed exactly as it would have proceeded without the loan. except that her $30,000 would be in the pool of Chester's assets that the foreclosure would consume. The $30,000 would not save the farm. It would extend the distance between now and losing it, while making the loss more expensive for her. She said she could not lend him the money. He sat with that. He had come prepared for the answer to be yes, and prepared for the answer to be no. And she could see in the way he absorbed it that he had believed the second option was the more likely one. He set his cup down and stood up and said he understood and was sorry for taking her time. He picked up his hat. He walked to the door. He stopped on the step without turning around. He said he knew she had a reason he was not seeing. He said that was the part of it that he could not fully accept, that the woman who had put $40 on a broken machine at a liquidation sale in front of the entire county and been right, was now declining to help him, and was also probably right about that. He said that was a hard thing to sit with. He went to his truck. She did not call after him. She sat at the table for a long time with the 2 coffee cups and the numbers that had not changed. The farm ledger was in the drawer beside the table. In it was a savings account balance of $118,000. The small notebook was in her jacket pocket. The last several pages of it had been used for a different kind of calculation than the engine rebuild that had preceded them. Land in Grundy County sold under foreclosure typically brought between 70 and 90% of assessed value. 160 acres conservatively valued at $1,200 per acre, parceled into 2 lots. The North 80 was the better ground and would attract the most competition. She had been watching the parcel records and the price history for 8 months. She had written a number at the top of the last page of the notebook and drawn a line under it. 3 weeks after Chester Holden walked out of her kitchen, the notice appeared in the Grundy County paper. Holden Farm Liquidation. 160 acres. 2 parcels. Grundy County ground that had been in the Holden family since 1912. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. She read it twice and folded the paper. She opened the small notebook to the last page and looked at the number she had written there. Then she wrote a second number below it. The balance in the savings account minus operating reserves minus a margin she did not intend to cross. What remained was the ceiling. She looked at the ceiling. It was enough. The morning of the Holden auction arrived with a sky the color of old concrete, low and still, the kind of October sky that does not promise anything in either direction. Willa was at the auction grounds by 9:15, which was 45 minutes before the bidding was scheduled to begin. She parked the truck at the edge of the field that was serving as overflow parking and walked across ground that was soft from 2 nights of rain. The soil came up in small clumps on her boots, the way Grundy County soil does, dark and dense. The kind of ground that holds water and holds value, and has been worth fighting over since the first settlers came through and understood what they were looking at. She found a position near the back of the crowd that was assembling around the auction block. From there, she could see the entirety of the gathered people without being visible to most of them. 60 or so had come. Farmers, land managers, a few men in coats that were too clean for field work. The Holden family stood at the east edge of the crowd. Chester was there with his wife and his son, a young man in his middle 20s who had the look of someone who has been preparing himself for a thing that has arrived anyway. Chester's wife had her arm through his. Chester was looking at the ground in front of him, the way a man looks at something he is trying to memorize before it is taken from him. Willa did not look at Chester again after that first assessment. What needed to happen today would happen independent of his watching it. She saw Owen Stratton before he saw her. He was standing with a younger man near the portable lectern the auctioneer had set up, both of them carrying clipboards. Both of them in the dress of people who have traveled from somewhere larger to conduct business in a place they consider smaller. Owen was no longer at Grundy County Farmers Bank. She had learned this through the property filings she had been reading since the previous spring. He was now a land acquisition representative for Heartland Capital Group out of Des Moines, a firm that had been purchasing distressed agricultural parcels in central Iowa for 3 years. She had seen the Heartland Capital name on several of the acquisition deeds in the courthouse records. She had not known Owen Stratton was the man behind the name until she saw him standing at the edge of this auction with his clipboard. He recognized her at the same moment. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement. She returned it in kind. Neither of them moved toward the other. The auctioneer called the crowd to attention at 10:15. He announced the terms, described the 2 parcels, and noted that each would be offered separately with the option for the buyer of the first parcel to bid on the second before it was open to the full crowd. Standard procedure. He described the North 80 as the better graded piece, which was accurate and which everyone present already knew. The North parcel opened at $800 per acre. 3 hands went up in the first 30 seconds. Willa's was not among them. She stood with her hands in the pockets of her canvas jacket and watched the early bidding with the patience of a person who has been planning this particular morning for 8 months and is not going to let the first 5 minutes of it change the plan. At 900, the crowd thinned to 4 bidders. At 1,000, it was 3. At 1050, the third bidder, a farm management company out of Ames, whose representative had been making notes on a clipboard since the beginning, dropped out with the body language of a man who has found his ceiling and is comfortable with it. Owen Stratton came to 1100. The auctioneer looked around the crowd. Willa watched him complete the full arc of his survey. She waited until his eyes had moved past her before she raised her hand. $1,150 per acre. The effect was not immediate. There was a beat of approximately 2 seconds during which the people near her registered the raised hand and began the process of identifying its source, and then a quiet reorientation moved through the gathering, the way a shift in wind moves through standing corn, not loud, not dramatic, but perceptible to anyone paying attention. Several heads turned. Boyd Mercer, who was standing 20 feet to her left and had come to the auction because these were the occasions the county showed up for, went very still. Owen Stratton looked at her with an expression that was something other than calculation. It was recognition. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone they are seeing in context for the first time, when the history they know about that person and the situation they are currently in converge into a single understanding. He turned to the younger man beside him. They spoke in the low tones of a quick consultation. Heartland Capital, 1,200 per acre. Willa, 1,250. Owen turned back to his associate. The consultation was longer this time. Willa stood with her hands in her pockets and her eyes on the auctioneer and did not look at Owen or his associate or anyone else in the crowd. She had looked at the ceiling in the small notebook enough times that it lived in her with the same certainty as her own address. She knew where she was standing. She did not need to check again. Owen looked at her one more time. It was the look of a man trying to read a poker hand from the other side of the table, trying to determine whether the person across from him is at their limit or has room they are not showing. He did not find what he needed in her face. She had not put it there for him to find. Heartland Capital did not bid again. The auctioneer said sold at $1,250 per acre. 80 acres. $100,000. Willa took the checkbook from her inside jacket pocket. She had carried it in that pocket since 7 o'clock that morning. She opened it on her forearm and wrote the check with the pen she kept clipped to the cover. The amount, the payee, the date. She signed her name with the same signature she had been writing since she was old enough to have a bank account. Neither hurried nor performed. Before the pen finished the last letter of her name, she thought briefly of Harlan. Not of his face or his voice, but of a specific number, $41,000, the total he had left in a savings account at this same bank after 30 years of spending less than he earned. She had built from that foundation. This check was what that foundation had made possible. She tore it out and handed it to the auctioneer's assistant, who looked at it once and looked at her once and walked it to the table. The crowd was quiet. Not the quiet of a pause between actions, but the quality of silence that settles over a group of people who have simultaneously understood something they had not understood before. No one spoke. No one moved in any obvious direction. The sound that was loudest was the wind crossing the open field to the north, the same field she had just purchased, moving across it, as it would have moved across it yesterday and the day before, and as it would move across it tomorrow, regardless of whose name was on the deed. Owen Stratton put his pen in his coat pocket. He closed his clipboard. He looked at Willa across the crowd with the expression of a man who has lost a clean transaction and understands why. He gave a single nod, precise and unambiguous, the acknowledgement of one professional to another, after a negotiation that was conducted correctly by both sides. Then he turned and walked with his associate toward the parking area, and she watched them go until they had cleared the edge of the crowd. Boyd was beside her when she turned back. He had moved without her noticing. He stood close enough to speak quietly and said nothing for several seconds. Then he said she should know that he had not understood this, that he had not understood it in 1987, and had not understood it in 1988, and had still not understood it this morning when he arrived. He said he was beginning to understand it now. She looked at him. He was her sister's husband, and he had known her since she was 18 years old, and she could count on one hand the number of times she had seen him uncertain, which was what he was in this moment. She told him that was enough. He nodded and stayed where he was, and she moved toward the table to complete the paperwork. Chester Holden was at the east edge of the crowd when she finished at the table. She walked in a direction that did not take her past him and did not avoid him either. Their paths did not cross. She drove home on county roads she had been driving since she was old enough to have a license, roads she knew well enough to navigate with her mind on other things. And her mind was on the field she had just purchased, and what would need to happen in it before spring. Boyd called that evening at 8 o'clock. She answered on the second ring, and he spoke without preamble. He said he wanted to tell her something he had been carrying for 15 years and had not said. He said that on the day she unpacked the suitcase in 1974, he had told her sister Donna that it was the first foolish thing he had ever seen Willa do. He said he had believed that for a long time. He said he was sorry for it. She held the phone and listened to the particular quality of a man delivering a truth that has cost him something to carry to this point. And she heard it clearly. And she said there was nothing to forgive, because he had not known. He said knowing was the part he wished had come sooner. She told him that their father had not needed her to stay. He had needed her to learn while she was staying, and she had. She told him to bring his daughter Penny out in the summer, and she would show her the shop. Boyd was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She said good night. 3 weeks passed. Then Chester Holden came back. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, same as the first time, and sat at the same kitchen table. This time he had not come to ask for anything. He sat with his hat in his hands and asked her what she intended to do with the North 80. She poured coffee and sat down and told him. She set a folded piece of paper on the table between them. He unfolded it and read it without rushing. The terms were for a lease at $60 per acre per year, below the current market rate by roughly 40%. Attached to the lease was a separate agreement giving Chester the right to purchase any 10-acre segment of the parcel at any time within 10 years. At the price she had paid $1,250 per acre, with no escalation clause. He read both documents twice. He set them on the table. He looked out the window at the field north of the house that had been his family's ground for 77 years before it became hers, 2 weeks ago. He asked her if she had known this was where it was going when he came to her door in September. She said she had thought it was possible. He asked why she had not told him. She said because in September he had needed the bank to say no before he could hear anything she might have said. If she had laid this on the table in September, he would have left the same way he had left after she declined the loan, which was to say he would have left with his self-respect intact and her offer rejected. He needed to arrive at this table having exhausted every other option first. She said that was not a comfortable thing to admit to knowing about a person, but that it was the truth. He sat with that for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. The afternoon light through the south window was the low amber of late October, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is being seen for the last time, or remembered for the first. He said that the hardest part of the last several years had not been losing the land. The hardest part had been sitting in the same county as someone who had seen what was coming and had not lost anything and trying to figure out whether the difference between his situation and hers was luck or intelligence or something else that he did not have a name for, that made him feel the way a man feels when he suspects he has been given every piece he needed and still assembled it wrong. She said the difference was one decision made the same way repeatedly for 30 years. She said her father had made that decision, and she had watched him make it long enough that she had made it too. She said it was not luck, and it was not intelligence. It was a habit of refusing to let the bank own what she could own herself, applied without exception across 3 decades. She said it was simpler than it sounded and harder than it looked. He picked up the 2 pieces of paper and folded them back along their original creases. He said he needed to think. She said she understood. He stood and put on his hat and went to the door. He stopped on the step. He said the thing that kept coming back to him, the thing he could not get out of his head since the morning of the auction, was that she had been willing to do this all along. That the offer on the table now was something she had been prepared to make since before she ever raised her hand to bid. He said that a different kind of person would have used the auction to settle a score. She said she was not interested in settling scores. She said the land was more useful to her with someone farming it who knew it than sitting empty while she stretched herself too thin to work it right. He nodded at the air in front of him. He walked to his truck and drove north. 6 days later, he came back and signed both documents. The lease began the following March. In the spring of 1990, on a morning in the second week of April, Willa was running the Oliver on the south half of the original farm property when she came to the end of a furrow at the boundary of the 2 parcels. Across the fence line on the other side of the ground that had changed hands twice in 6 months, Chester Holden was at the wheel of his tractor, working the leased acres in the opposite direction. They came to their respective fence ends at approximately the same moment. Neither of them stopped. Neither of them crossed to the other side. They were 2 farmers at the end of their rows, each visible to the other, across the width of a property line, each with ground under the plow that was where it needed to be. Chester raised his hand once briefly, the flat palm acknowledgement that one farmer makes to another when there is no other vocabulary available for the occasion. Willa raised hers in return. Both of them put their machines back in gear. She thought on the way down that next furrow that Harlan would have recognized the scene without needing it explained to him. He would have looked at the 2 tractors working 2 sides of a shared fence line, one of them his daughter's, and the other belonging to a man who was slowly buying back what he had lost, at the kind of rate a man can sustain without breaking. And he would have said nothing and nodded in the way he nodded when something was coming out right. She ran the Oliver through that planting season, and the 3 after it without any mechanical attention, beyond the scheduled maintenance her logbook called for. The summers came and went with their variations of wet and dry, and the farm absorbed them all from the foundation of an operation that carried no debt to amplify the damage of a bad year. Chester paid his lease on time the first year, and the second and every year thereafter. In 1993, he bought back the first 10 acres using the option agreement. In 1996, he bought another 10. He told his son the terms of the arrangement when the boy was old enough to understand contracts, and the son asked why the woman who had purchased the family land would agree to sell it back at the same price she had paid, without accounting for appreciation. Chester told him he would understand in 10 years. It took 7. In the summer of 1994, a girl named Lena Carver came to the farm for the first time in a working capacity. She was the daughter of Willa's younger brother, and she was 14 years old. She had been spending parts of her summers at the farm since she was old enough to be useful, doing the kinds of tasks that farms produce in quantity and that require more attention than skill. But this was the summer she came to the shop. It happened without ceremony. Willa was pulling the water pump on the combine at 6 in the morning when Lena appeared in the shop doorway in her work clothes. She did not ask if she could watch. She just stood there until the silence established itself as an invitation. Willa handed her the flashlight without looking up. Lena held it on the work without being told where the light needed to be. She had her mother's eyes and her great-uncle Harlan's instinct for keeping her attention where it was needed rather than where it was comfortable. They worked through the water pump replacement without conversation. When Willa was satisfied with the installation, she stood up and told Lena to note where she had put each tool when she was done and replace it in that exact location. Lena asked why. Willa said because there will be a time when you need it in the dark. Lena looked at the pegboard with the focused expression of a person performing a memorization, and then went back to cleaning the area around the pump, housing the way Willa had shown her. Willa taught her over 2 summers the way Harlan had taught Willa, by proximity and repetition, by letting the machine be the primary teacher, and serving as the interpreter only when the machine's language was too specialized to decode without help. She taught Lena to lay parts out on the rag in order of disassembly. She taught her that a torque spec is not a suggestion, and that the person who decides to do it by feel instead of by gauge is the person who calls the shop a week later. She taught her to clean the work area before she started, not after, because a clean area around a machine tells you immediately when something has gone wrong. By the end of Lena's second working summer, she could set valve lash with a feeler gauge, read a micrometer, and identify the general condition of a diesel engine by the quality of its running note, before the hood was ever opened. In the summer of 1996, Willa sent Lena to clean out the lowest drawer of the old tool cabinet in the back corner, the drawer that had not been opened in at least 3 years and possibly longer. Lena brought a small tin box to the bench. She set it in front of Willa and said she had found it at the back of the drawer, under a folded shop rag. Willa looked at the box. It was the kind of tin that had originally held hard candies, the lid slightly domed, the paint worn to bare metal at the corners. She knew it. She had seen it on the shelf above the workbench in this shop for the first 20 years of her life, and had not seen it since. She had assumed it had gone with other things when the shop was cleaned after Harlan died. She opened it. Inside, rolled and held with a rubber band, was a thin notebook with a cloth cover, the kind sold at hardware stores in the 1960s for a dime. She slid the rubber band off carefully. It had been on the notebook long enough that it left a permanent impression in the cover. She opened the notebook. It was Harlan's. The handwriting was his compressed printing, smaller here than in the pages Frank Briggs had kept the writing of a younger man. The entries ran from sometime in the early 1960s through the middle of the decade. Technical observations, torque sequences, notes on the behavior of specific machines under specific conditions. On several pages there were sketches, cross-sections of engine components drawn in pencil with dimension notations in the margins, precise enough to be useful, and rough enough to have been made during the actual work rather than reconstructed afterward. Lena stood beside her and looked at the open notebook with the attentiveness she brought to everything in the shop. She asked whose it was. Willa told her it had been her grandfather's, the grandfather who had built this shop and poured this floor and hung those tools on that pegboard. Lena asked if she could read it. Willa set the notebook on the bench in front of her. She said she would show her how to understand the notations. The reading itself Lena could do on her own. Lena opened to the first page and read without speaking for several minutes. Willa went back to the work that had been interrupted. The shop was quiet in the way it was always quiet when something necessary was happening, which was the quality of quiet Willa associated with her father more than any other single thing. His ability to let the work proceed without filling the space around it. She looked up once at Lena bent over the notebook at the bench, the same bench Harlan had built from salvaged oak planks under the same light, and felt something that she had no precise word for and did not try to name. The notebook had waited in the tin box in the bottom drawer for more than a decade. It had waited for someone who could read it not as history, but as instruction. That person was now reading it. That was enough. In the summer of 1998, the Grundy County Farm Bureau invited her to speak at the annual meeting. She was not a person who sought occasions of this kind, and the people who knew her were genuinely surprised when she accepted, though none of them said so to her directly. The community hall in Grundy Center held about 90 people and had 82 in it that evening. She stood at the front with her hands at her sides and spoke for 8 minutes without notes, which is about as long as a person can hold the attention of a room on a summer evening when the windows are open and there is still light outside. She said she had been farming Grundy County ground for 20 years and had not once carried a mortgage or an operating loan, and that this was not the result of superior intelligence or unusual fortune, but of a principle her father had stated often enough, that she could repeat it without thinking, which was that a machine you own outright works for you, and a machine you are paying for works for the bank. She said she had applied this to everything, to equipment, to land, to the decision about how much to spend in a good year, when the arithmetic made it look easy to borrow into the next one. She told the room about a tractor she had purchased in October of 1987 for $40 at a liquidation sale, which several people in the room remembered clearly, and some of them had been part of the conversation about at the diner counter in the days that followed. She said she had rebuilt that tractor for $439 in parts, using her father's tools in her father's shop, and that it was still in her field, still running the engine she had rebuilt in January of 1988, and that a comparable machine purchased new with financing in 1987 would have cost approximately $24,000 once the interest was accounted for across a 5-year note. She said the difference between those two numbers was 100 acres of Grundy County ground at the going rate. It was also the difference between being at the auction in October of 1989 and being among the people watching someone else bid. She said she had watched good farmers lose good farms throughout the 1980s, and she wanted to say clearly that what she had observed was not a failure of character or effort or farming ability in the people who had lost. It was the consequence of a set of financial decisions that were normal. She used that word specifically, normal. She said the bank recommended those decisions. The equipment dealers recommended them. The agricultural extension offices recommended them. And that normal in the agricultural economy of the late 1970s had come to mean heavily leveraged, and heavily leveraged had come to mean dependent on conditions remaining favorable. And when the conditions stopped being favorable, the leverage became the mechanism of loss, rather than the instrument of growth it had been sold as. She said her father had believed that a paid-for tool was worth more than a new tool with a payment attached to it, and that she had spent 20 years finding out he was correct. She expected to spend the next 20 years finding out the same thing again. Then she sat down. The room was quiet in the particular way that follows something that has named a thing that was previously unnamed. Then someone began to applaud, and the room joined in. She became aware as the applause settled of a man in the middle rows who had been slow to join it. He was in his early 50s now, heavier than she remembered from the farm visits and the auction, wearing a coat that was still slightly too formal for the occasion. Owen Stratton had been sitting 8 rows from the front. She had not seen him when she entered because she had not been looking for him. He was looking at his hands when the applause ended. The expression on his face was not comfortable and was not performed. She stood and moved toward the aisle, and he stood as well. And they arrived at the same point near the door at the same moment, which may or may not have been coincidental. He asked her if she remembered his visit to her farm in the fall of 1986. She said she did. He said he had spent 12 years in agricultural lending and the following 3 in land acquisition, and had thought about that kitchen table conversation more times than he could count. He said he had come to understand that she had asked him a question that afternoon that he had not been able to answer honestly, and had not tried to answer at all. He said she had been right to show him the door. She looked at him in the way she looked at machinery she was assessing, not with judgment, but with attention. She said she did not think he had come to her farm in bad faith. She said the problem was that the product he had been selling was designed to work when everything went right, and he had not been required to spend much time contemplating what it looked like when something went wrong. He said that was an accurate description. She said she had not been wise. She had been taught. He nodded at that. She walked past him through the door and into the evening air, and he did not follow. Among the people in that room was a young man she did not know, approximately 35 years old, who had come with a relative who farmed east of town. She had noticed him when she was speaking, because he had done something that she recognized. He had taken a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket and begun writing on it during the part of her remarks about the cost of financed equipment versus owned equipment. Not her words. His own calculations, running the numbers she had cited through his own situation. He was not listening for inspiration. He was listening for information he could use, and he had found some, and he was writing it down before it left him. She had seen her father do that. She had done it herself. She did not know the young man's name and did not need to. Chester Holden was near the door when she stepped outside. He had come to the meeting because these were his occasions, the gatherings of people who farmed the same ground. He had farmed for 30 years in the land adjacent to it, and because his situation had changed enough in the preceding 9 years, that he came to them differently now than he had come to them before. He had bought back 40 acres of the original parcel. He was working a smaller operation than his father had worked, but it was clean, no debt, every season's income going forward rather than back. His son was farming with him now. He did not say anything when she came through the door. He stood at an angle that was not blocking her path, but was close enough to constitute a moment rather than a coincidence. She stopped. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has been carrying a statement for a long time and has arrived at the occasion where it can finally be set down. He said that he had thought for many years that the difference between her outcome and his was that she had been shown something he had not been shown. He said he no longer thought that. He said he thought now that she had been shown the same things or close to the same things that most people in the county had been shown, but that she had kept paying attention when the lesson stopped being comfortable. He said that was what he had failed to do. He said he wanted her to know that he understood the distinction. She stood with that for a moment. Then she said, "Chester, you have paid your lease on time for 9 years, and you have bought back 40 acres at the original price, and your son is farming that ground with you now." She said that was not a man who stopped paying attention. He looked at her. She said goodnight and walked to her truck. She drove home on the county roads in the dark with the windows down, because October in Iowa still carries the smell of turned earth after dark, and she had driven these roads for 25 years and had not yet stopped noticing that smell. The fields on both sides of the road were quiet, in the way they are quiet after harvest emptied and resting, waiting for whatever the next season would ask of them. She had driven these roads in every season since she was old enough to hold a wheel, and every season looked the same, and every season was different, in the specific ways that only someone who had been watching the same ground for decades would be able to identify. She had been watching. She intended to keep watching. In the spring of 2003, Lena Carver took over the daily operations of the farm at 23 years old. Willa was 47 and had no intention of stopping work, only of redistributing it. There was a distinction between those two things that mattered to her. The Oliver 1650 was still in service. The engine she had rebuilt in the winter of 1988 had accumulated 4,200 hours by the time Lena took the wheel for her first solo planting season. It had required a valve adjustment in the spring of 1993 and a water pump replacement in 1995. Those were the total of its mechanical needs in 15 years of fieldwork. She had written each of those events in the notebook in the same handwriting she had used for every entry since 1986, and the notebook was almost full. The shop stood as it had always stood. Harlan had poured the concrete floor in 2 sections in 1961, and the floor was still sound. No heaving, no cracking. Significant enough to affect the work that happened on it. The wood stove in the northeast corner was the same one he had installed its firebox, replaced once in 1991, but the outer casing original black from 4 decades of heat. The oak workbench held the same machinist's vise, and the same drill press occupied the same corner, and the tools on the pegboard above the bench were in the same positions they had been in since before Willa's memory could reach. Lena knew those positions the way you know the geography of a room you have moved through without light enough times that your body has recorded it as landscape. This was not something she had been taught by instruction. It was something she had absorbed by working in the same space long enough that the space became part of her. On an evening in her second week of running the farm, the electrical circuit that fed the shop lighting tripped and did not reset. It was 9 o'clock at night, and she was in the middle of a fuel line repair on the Oliver that could not wait until morning without risking the morning's work schedule. She had been working in the main overhead light, and suddenly, she had nothing. She stood in the complete dark for a moment. The shop had no windows on the north wall, and the nearest exterior light was far enough that it came through the south window as a suggestion, rather than an illumination. She had her work light on the floor aimed at the fuel system, but what she needed was the 3/8 combination wrench from the bench pegboard to torque the fitting she had just seated. She did not reach for her phone. She walked to the bench from where she was standing 7 steps in a direction she knew. and put her hand on the pegboard at the height and location where the 3/8 combination wrench had lived since before she was born. Her hand closed around it. She stood in the dark for a moment with the wrench in her hand. Then she went back to the tractor and finished the repair. Later, after the circuit had been reset and the lights were back and the work was logged and the shop was locked for the night, she stood on the concrete step outside the shop door and looked at the farm in the dark. The north field was just visible as a shape against the lighter dark of the sky. Chester Holden's son was farming the parcels his family had bought back, running his own operation with his own equipment, none of it financed. Chester had mentioned this the previous spring with the particular satisfaction of a man reporting on an outcome he had stopped believing was possible and then watched happen anyway. She looked at the barn and the house and the shop, 3 buildings that had stood through the farm crisis and the drought years and the commodity swings and the steady attrition of small operations that had continued through the 90s and into the new century. None of them had been borrowed against. All of them were exactly what they appeared to be: assets, free of the obligation to remain profitable in order to remain possessed. Inside the shop, the tools were on their pegs in the positions they had always occupied. The notebook was in the drawer. Harlan's tin box was on the shelf. The Oliver sat in its winter position against the north wall, its rebuilt engine quiet, its gauges at rest, still capable of pulling a 4-bottom plow through Grundy County ground on a March morning before the fields of neighboring operations had been touched. What Willa Carver had built from a $40 machine and the tools her father left her was not a story about a tractor. The tractor was the beginning of the proof, not the proof itself. What she had built was the thing her father had named for her in a principle she could recite without thinking, which was the distance between owning something and servicing the debt on something, the distance between a tool that works for you and a tool that works for the bank. That distance measured in dollars and years and decisions made the same way over and over, when the same way was the harder way, amounted to a paid-for farm and a $100,000 check and a shop full of tools that would go to the next person who understood what to do with them. In the county, the versions of the story that circulated had changed over the years. The first version, the one from October of 1987, had been about a bad decision. The second version from March of 1988 had been about a machine that ran. The third version, the one that had been circulating since October of 1989, when the silence followed the check, was harder to reduce to a single sentence, which was part of why it kept being told. It was a story about what a person can build when they refuse to let anyone else determine the cost of what they need. The wrench was still on the pegboard. It always would be.